Clara Whitlow stood alone in the biting wind, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes and settling on her pale, trembling hands. The shovel felt impossibly heavy, almost too heavy for her fragile frame to lift. But heavier still was the weight of judgment she felt from the townspeople of Ashridge, their cold stares piercing deeper than the winter chill. She paused, brushing the damp hair from her eyes, feeling the accusing gaze of her late husband's family cutting into her soul. They had gathered at the small, wind-swept cemetery, dressed in black, a grim line of accusation etched onto their hardened faces. Even in grief, their resentment was evident. They blamed her for Elias Whitlow's death, though no one dared speak openly of it. The whispers, however, filled every corner of the small frontier town. As the preacher concluded the prayers, Abigail felt the judgment closing in around her. She knew the silence that followed meant condemnation. Jonathan's family refused even to look at her as they silently turned away, leaving her standing by the freshly filled grave, alone, utterly abandoned. Abigail's heart sank. She knew what came next. Abigail came the gruff voice of Martin Whitlow, Jonathan's older brother, a man whose mere presence filled her with dread. "You are no longer welcome in the family home. You brought nothing but shame upon us." "I didn't." Abigail started, her voice brittle and trembling from cold and anguish. "Enough," Henry snapped. His eyes flashed with contempt. "You buried him. Now leave." Abigail stood frozen, her coat thin and inadequate against the storm that now raged around her. The townsfolk had quietly retreated, unwilling to interfere or offer comfort. Their whispers would soon become stories, each more damning than the last. She felt utterly abandoned, cast out as the snow fell thicker, blurring her vision and muffling all sound except the rapid beating of her heart. Shivering, Abigail began the long walk away from the cemetery, snow clinging heavily to her skirts. She had nowhere to go. Jonathan had been her entire world, and despite his cruelty, the marriage had at least provided shelter and security. Now stripped of all protection, Abigail felt desperately exposed, her vulnerability stark against the barren, snowy landscape. Hours seemed to pass as she wandered aimlessly, her strength ebbing away. She stumbled forward, her mind numbed by grief and cold, her feet burned with frostbite, her lungs aching from breathing the icy air. Finally, she collapsed, the world spinning into darkness as the storm howled louder. In the distance, a shadowy figure moved silently through the relentless snowfall. Cloaked in heavy fur, the man walked deliberately, each step sure and purposeful. The townsfolk spoke of him only in fearful whispers. A ghostly figure, a man of mystery and solitude. Rowan Hale paused, noticing something strange beneath the snow-covered pines. Approaching cautiously, he knelt down and brushed snow away, revealing Abigail's pale, unconscious face. For a brief moment he hesitated, eyes narrowed with suspicion, but something in her quiet vulnerability touched a hidden chord deep within him. Without a word, Cole lifted her gently, cradling her frail form carefully against his chest, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his weathered hat. He turned toward the distant mountains where his cabin lay hidden, each step deliberate and careful, sheltering her from the storm as though she were something precious and delicate. As Abigail rested unconsciously in his arms, her breathing shallow and uneven, Cole carried her away from the cruel eyes of Ashridge into the sheltering silence of his solitary world. Little did they know, in that silent moment, fate had intertwined their lives forever. Abigail awoke slowly, her mind fogged by confusion and the lingering chill of winter. A heavy blanket enveloped her, warm and comforting, unlike anything she'd felt in days. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim glow of a crackling fire nearby. The gentle heat was a welcome contrast to the memory of freezing snow. Slowly, she turned her head, examining her surroundings. The rough timber walls of a small cabin encircled her, rustic but secure, insulating her from the icy wilderness outside. Abigail struggled to sit up, noticing for the first time her bandaged hands, carefully tended and wrapped in clean cloth. A sudden movement from the corner startled her, and her heart leaped anxiously. In the soft firelight she saw him clearly, a silent figure, rugged and imposing. He stood near a wooden table, cutting slices of bread and smoked meat. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially shadowing piercing, troubled eyes. He glanced toward her briefly, offering a gentle nod, but he said nothing. "Who are you?" Abigail asked, her voice weak and unsteady. Silence greeted her question, and unease rose within her. The man simply approached slowly, setting a plate beside her, caught, his movements deliberate and careful, as though avoiding any unnecessary disturbance. "You saved me," she whispered uncertainly, searching his face for answers. Again, silence. Abigail felt an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. The townsfolk had warned her about the hermit Rowan Hale, a loner feared and distrusted. Now she was entirely at his mercy. Yet oddly she sensed no threat. Rather, the quiet gentleness in his movements suggested kindness, not danger. Days passed quietly in the small cabin, marked by gentle, wordless routines. Cole brought food, kept the fire stoked, and changed her bandages with patient care, never once speaking a word. Abigail adjusted slowly to this silent rhythm, wondering constantly why he maintained this careful distance. His silence filled her with curiosity and, oddly, with comfort. One afternoon, while Cole stepped outside to chop wood, Abigail cautiously explored the cabin, her strength gradually returning. She found the room austere, yet filled with subtle hints of a former life. An embroidered handkerchief, an abandoned sewing kit, a child's wooden toy hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Abigail's heart tightened with empathy as she pieced together fragments of Cole's painful past. A gust of wind brought a brief chill as Cole entered, arms laden with logs. He paused briefly, noticing her gaze fixed upon the small wooden horse she had discovered. For the first time, Abigail clearly saw pain in his eyes, raw and intense, before he quietly looked away. "I'm sorry," she whispered softly. "I didn't mean." Cole lifted his hand, gently silencing her with a simple gesture. Their eyes met briefly, a world of sorrow reflected in his gaze. Abigail understood instinctively. Some pains were too deep for words. He placed the logs beside the fireplace and stirred the flames gently, his posture rigid as though carrying an unbearable weight. That evening, as the storm outside intensified, Abigail watched Cole closely. She felt an overwhelming urge to break through the barrier between them, yet respected his silence. Still, questions filled her mind, questions she feared might never be answered. Finally, unable to hold back, she softly spoke into the quiet darkness. "Thank you, Cole." He looked up sharply, surprised she knew his name, but nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of trust forming between them. No words were needed. They sat quietly together as the fire cast flickering shadows upon the walls, each recognizing in the other a soul burdened by secrets and suffering. In the solitude of the cabin, something profound had begun, a quiet bond, born from shared vulnerability and silent understanding. Abigail realized that for now, silence was their shared language, more powerful than words could ever be. She felt strangely safe in the presence of this silent stranger, who had rescued her without a single spoken word. And somewhere deep inside her heart, hope took root again, fragile yet unmistakably alive. In the isolated cabin deep within the snowy mountains, Abigail found herself adjusting quietly to life alongside Rowan Hale. Days merged gently into one another, each sunrise bringing with it a slow, quiet rhythm that began to feel comforting, rather than oppressive. The silence, once unsettling, now seemed a form of gentle refuge. Each morning, Abigail would awaken to the faint crackle of the fire, finding Cole already busy with daily tasks. She watched quietly from her bed as he prepared simple meals, chopped wood, and ensured the cabin remained warm and safe. Though no words passed between them, Cole's careful actions spoke louder than any sentence could. In his movements, Abigail saw a quiet promise of protection. One morning, gathering courage, Abigail rose from her bed and stepped toward the door, pulling the heavy coat Cole had silently provided her. Her limbs felt stronger now, restored by warmth, nourishment, and the quiet comfort of his presence. Stepping outside, she took a deep, invigorating breath, allowing the cold air to fill her lungs. The landscape was stark and beautiful, a white wilderness stretching infinitely, broken only by dark, snow-laden pines. A soft crunch behind her revealed Cole's presence. She turned, meeting his silent gaze. For the first time, Abigail saw his guarded expression soften slightly, as though relieved she was finally strong enough to venture outside. Without speaking, he motioned for her to follow him toward the woodpile. She hesitated briefly, then joined him, realizing he intended to teach her how to handle the axe. Abigail took the axe nervously, the weight unfamiliar in her hand. Cole demonstrated slowly, patiently, and watched attentively as she awkwardly swung at the wood, missing entirely on her first attempt. Embarrassed, Abigail glanced anxiously at him, only to find a rare, quiet smile curving his lips, transforming his usually stern face into something tender. Encouraged by his gentle nod, she swung again, this time striking true, splitting the log neatly. Pride swelled within her chest, amplified by Cole's quiet approval. Over the following days, Abigail learned more tasks from Cole, preparing snares for rabbits, melting snow for fresh water, and keeping the fire lit through the bitterly cold nights. Each lesson strengthened the quiet bond forming between them. Words remained scarce, yet they communicated seamlessly through subtle glances, gestures, and shared labor. At night, As the fire cast comforting shadows, Abigail found herself stealing occasional glances at Cole, curiosity burning within her. He often sat by the fire, gazing silently into the flames. His face illuminated softly. The sorrow etched deeply into his features hinted at a profound loss she couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, as Cole repaired a worn leather harness, Abigail finally broke the quiet tension. "Cole, can I ask something?" Her voice trembled slightly. His eyes met hers instantly, alert but patient. "Why don't you speak?" Abigail asked, gently, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and contemplation. A long silence passed, broken only by the crackling of logs. Finally, he looked back at the harness, his voice deep and rough, as though unused for years. "Words can't bring them back." Abigail's heart tightened, immediately understanding his immense pain. Without another word, she moved closer, placing her small hand gently upon his rough, calloused one. Cole tensed briefly, startled by her touch, but slowly relaxed, silently accepting her quiet comfort. Together they sat in gentle silence, warmed by the fire, and the unspoken trust growing steadily between them. Abigail realized that words were not always necessary. Their mutual understanding transcended speech, connecting them profoundly through shared suffering and quiet acts of kindness. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the trees, as if carrying secrets only they could understand. Inside the cabin, two souls silently healed one another, each offering what little they had left, a quiet strength, profound empathy, and the hope that perhaps healing might finally be possible. The days grew shorter as winter tightened its relentless grip on the routine she'd built with Cole. Though silence often filled the cabin, their bond had quietly deepened into something meaningful, something secure. Yet the past was never truly forgotten, lingering quietly beneath the surface. One quiet afternoon, as Cole ventured out into the snowy woods to set new traps, Abigail found herself alone inside the cabin. The crackling fire cast warm, amber hues across the rough timber walls, illuminating shadows that danced like restless ghosts. Her eyes caught sight of a small trunk tucked discreetly in the corner, partially obscured beneath folded blankets and supplies. Curiosity tugged gently at her heart. Approaching the trunk carefully, Abigail hesitated, mindful of Cole's privacy, yet a deep, irresistible need to understand him overcame her caution. Slowly, almost reverently, she lifted the lid, her breath catching softly as she glimpsed the contents within. Inside, preserved lovingly, were precious fragments of Cole's hidden life, faded photographs depicting a woman with radiant eyes and a gentle smile, holding a young boy whose joyful face mirrored Cole's own features. Abigail's heart ached profoundly, recognizing the unmistakable marks of family, happiness, and love lost. Her fingers trembled as she lifted a delicate handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue flowers. Tears welled up as Abigail felt Cole's hidden sorrow reflected in the careful preservation of these cherished belongings. Suddenly, she heard the cabin door open, and her pulse quickened with guilt and anxiety. She turned sharply, meeting Cole's intense gaze. He froze, his expression tightening in pain, eyes fixed on the open trunk and the precious memories laid bare before him. For a moment, Abigail was certain he would react angrily, or withdraw further into silence. Instead, he lowered his head, shoulders sinking with quiet resignation. "I'm sorry," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to pry." Cole raised his hand gently, interrupting her. He slowly approached the trunk, kneeling beside her as though surrendering finally to the painful truth of his past. With cautious fingers, he picked up the photograph, tracing its edge with reverence. "Sarah and Caleb," he murmured, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Abigail watched closely as he fought to maintain his composure. "My wife and son, what happened?" Abigail's voice quivered softly, filled with compassion. Cole stared into the firelight, his eyes distant, lost in haunting memory. "There was a fire," he said quietly. "It took everything, my family, my home. I wasn't there to protect them." The weight of his confession pressed heavily upon Abigail's heart. She instinctively reached for his hand, gently clasping it, offering silent solace in the warmth of her touch. Cole looked down, startled momentarily by her boldness, yet he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers closed slowly around hers, accepting her quiet support. In the gentle stillness that followed, Abigail felt the invisible walls between them crumbling. Though both carried wounds too profound for words alone to heal, she sensed that together, they might find a path forward, out of darkness, and into something softer, something hopeful. Yet their tender moment was abruptly interrupted by the sound of distant voices outside the cabin. Cole tensed instantly, his eyes narrowing protectively. Rising swiftly, he moved toward the window, peering cautiously into the twilight shadows. Abigail followed, anxiety gripping her heart. Outside, figures moved through the snowy landscape, lanterns glowing faintly. Abigail's stomach knotted painfully as she recognized the unmistakable shapes of the sheriff's men. The past she had desperately tried to escape had finally come to reclaim her. Cole turned to her, eyes darkening with determination. Without words, he conveyed a silent promise of protection, offering Abigail strength she desperately needed. Together they stood, quietly, prepared to face whatever waited beyond the fragile walls of their sheltering sanctuary. And Abigail understood then, with profound clarity, that facing their pasts would be the only way to truly find peace, and perhaps redemption. The bitter wind whispered relentlessly through cracks in the cabin walls as shadows of lantern lights flickered ominously outside. Abigail felt her heartbeat quicken in dread, her fingers trembling as the sheriff's voice rang sharply through the night. "Rowan Hale," the sheriff called harshly. "We know she's in there. Bring her out and no harm will come to you." Cole stood firm, silently barring the door. His gaze, fierce yet steady, held Abigail's eyes in a wordless reassurance that he would protect her at all costs. But the threat outside was undeniable. Abigail's past had finally caught up with her, and the consequences seemed inevitable. She stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. "Cole, let me go, you've done enough already." Cole shook his head firmly, a quiet determination hardening his features. For the first time, his voice rose clearly, carrying strength born from long-held silence. "No." Abigail's breath caught, startled by his resolve. He glanced at her briefly, his eyes softening slightly with an unmistakable tenderness, before turning back to the window to watch their pursuers. The sheriff called again, impatient and growing hostile. "Hand her over, Bennett. She's dangerous. We have reason to believe she harmed her husband." Abigail felt her heart break under the accusation, tears welling in her eyes. "It was an accident," she whispered painfully. "He was hurting me. I never intended him harm." Cole turned sharply, eyes filled with immediate understanding and empathy. Without hesitation, he gently took her hand, leading her away from the door and sitting beside her near the fire. The wind howled relentlessly, and the voices outside faded momentarily, lost in the storm's wrath. "Tell me," Cole said gently, his voice calm yet insistent. Abigail trembled, finally ready to share her story. "Jonathan was cruel," she began, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Everyone saw his charm, his wealth, but never the man behind closed doors. That night he attacked me. I pushed him away in defense. He fell, hit his head. Didn't mean to hurt him, Cole, but no one believed me." Cole's eyes darkened with sorrow, silently absorbing her pain. After a quiet moment, he spoke softly, his words carrying profound weight. "You survived. You did what you had to." Abigail's heart filled with relief, hearing those words spoken aloud, words she had longed to hear since that tragic night. She leaned closer, trusting Cole deeply, comforted by his unwavering strength. Outside, the men's voices grew louder again, more insistent, pounding violently upon the cabin door. Cole rose with quiet authority, placing Abigail protectively behind him. His voice rang clear and commanding, startling Abigail with its raw power. "Leave us be," he called firmly, surprising even himself. "This woman is under my protection now." A tense silence followed, broken only by the relentless wind. Eventually, heavy footsteps retreated slowly, grudgingly, fading into the night. Relief washed over Abigail as she leaned weakly against Cole, gratitude overwhelming her heart. Cole turned to face her, his expression softer now, vulnerability replacing the earlier fierceness. "I lost my family because I wasn't there," he murmured softly, eyes shimmering with suppressed grief. "I won't lose you." His confession hung quietly in the air, profound and powerful, binding them together irrevocably. Abigail's eyes filled with tears, touched deeply by his vulnerability and trust. Slowly, she reached up, gently touching his cheek, her heart opening fully for the first time since Jonathan's death. "You've given me something I never thought I'd find again," Abigail whispered softly. "Hope." Cole leaned closer, cautiously yet inevitably, their faces inches apart. His voice trembled faintly with emotion. "Maybe we both deserve another chance." Outside, the storm finally began to ease, a gentle quiet settling around the cabin. As the snowfall softened, Inside, near the fire's warmth, two broken souls finally found solace and redemption in each other's arms, silently promising never again to face the bitter cold alone. The storm had passed, but the danger had not. By morning, a fresh layer of snow blanketed the world in a deceptive silence. Abigail stood at the cabin window, her heart heavy, watching the faint traces of boot prints disappearing into the tree line. The sheriff's men would return, and next time they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Behind her, Cole methodically packed supplies into two sturdy saddlebags. His movements were swift, precise, with a kind of grim finality. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and Abigail understood without a word. They had to leave. She crossed the room quickly, gathering the few possessions she had: a scarf, a worn pair of gloves, the memory of a life she could no longer claim. Fear gnawed at her stomach, but she forced herself to stay calm. Cole was trusting her to be strong, and she would not fail him. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the frozen mountains, they were riding hard through the dense pines, the breath of their horses clouding the frigid air. Cole led the way with unerring instinct, choosing hidden paths known only to a man who had long since turned his back on civilization. Abigail clung tightly to the saddle, her hands raw from the cold, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every sound, a crack of ice, a distant bird call, set her nerves on edge. Yet through it all, she felt a profound sense of safety in Cole's presence. No words were needed. The solid, unyielding way he moved, the way he constantly checked over his shoulder to ensure she kept pace, spoke volumes. Hours into their flight, as they crested a ridge overlooking a frozen river, Cole suddenly raised his hand in warning. Abigail halted immediately, her horse snorting and stamping nervously. In the valley below, she spotted movement. 3 riders, their dark shapes cutting sharply across the pristine snow. "They're tracking us," Abigail whispered, her throat dry. Cole nodded grimly, scanning the landscape. Then, without hesitation, he swung down from his horse and began leading the way on foot, guiding them off the open path and into a thicket of dense, snow-laden trees. The hours that followed tested Abigail's endurance beyond anything she had ever imagined. Her muscles screamed from exertion, her cheeks burned with cold, but she pressed on, refusing to be a burden. Cole's quiet strength drove her forward, a living promise that they would survive, together. As dusk approached, they reached a rocky outcropping overlooking a narrow gorge. Cole motioned for Abigail to dismount and led her down a steep, hidden path, barely wide enough for a single person. At the bottom, nestled between jagged rocks and ancient pines, was a small cave, nearly invisible from above. Inside, the air was musty and damp, but it was sheltered. Cole quickly built a small fire, shielding the light carefully with stones to prevent detection. Abigail huddled close to the warmth, watching as Cole tended to the horses with tireless devotion. When he finally sat beside her, the exhaustion on his face mirrored her own. Yet his eyes, when they met hers, still held that fierce, steady determination. "We can't run forever," Abigail said quietly, her voice barely more than a breath. Cole shook his head. "We're not running, we're surviving." His words struck a chord deep within her chest. All her life, Abigail had been surviving. Through Jonathan's cruelty, through the town's betrayal, through the loneliness that had nearly consumed her. But for the first time, she wasn't surviving alone. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his rough hand. Cole flinched slightly, as though unused to tenderness, but didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up, allowing her to lace her fingers through his. In the quiet dark of the cave, surrounded by the raw power of winter, Abigail realized that survival was no longer enough. With Cole, she wanted more: trust, hope, maybe even love. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, but inside, 2 battered souls found the strength to keep moving forward, side by side. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but tonight they had each other, and in that fragile, precious truth, they found the courage to believe in something beyond fear. Morning came with a sky heavy and low, promising another storm. In the muted light, Abigail and Cole emerged cautiously from the cave, their breath visible in the frigid air. They packed their meager belongings swiftly and silently. There was no need for words anymore. Survival had bound them together with threads stronger than speech. Cole led the way along an old deer trail, moving deeper into the wilderness. Abigail followed close behind, each step a testament to her growing strength. Days ago, she would have collapsed from exhaustion and fear. Now, with Cole's quiet strength anchoring her, she found reserves of courage she hadn't known existed. The snow deepened as they climbed higher, and by midday, fat flakes were falling steadily. Visibility shrank to mere yards, Yet Cole pressed on with the certainty of a man who trusted the land more than he trusted people. Abigail marveled at him, not just for his survival skills, but for his unwavering steadiness, his silent refusal to abandon her, even when it would have been easier. By late afternoon, they reached a dense thicket near a half-frozen stream. Cole knelt beside the water, breaking the thin ice to let the horses drink, while Abigail gathered dry branches from beneath a thick pine. They moved together in seamless rhythm, two souls adapting to the brutal demands of the land and to each other. As they sat by the small, carefully shielded fire that evening, Abigail stole a glance at Cole. His face, always so hard and unreadable, seemed softer in the firelight. His broad shoulders sagged slightly with fatigue, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of years spent battling unseen demons. "I never thanked you," Abigail said softly, cradling a tin cup of weak coffee between her hands. "For everything." Cole looked up, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he reached over and adjusted the blanket draped around her shoulders, his fingers brushing lightly against her hair. "You don't have to," he said, voice rough from disuse but steady. The simplicity of his words made Abigail's throat tighten. In a world where so many had turned their backs on her, here was a man who asked for nothing, who gave without expectation, whose actions spoke louder than any empty promises. The fire crackled softly between them. After a long pause, Cole spoke again, voice low. "You didn't deserve what they did to you." The words hung heavy in the cold night air. Abigail swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. No one, not even she herself, had ever dared say it out loud. The town had judged her, the foster family had condemned her, and she had borne it all in silence. Until now, tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough for a lifetime. Instead, she reached across the fire, her fingers closing around Cole's calloused hand. He stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. For a long time they simply sat like that, hand in hand, drawing strength from the silent connection between them. When the fire burned low and the snow piled thick against the trees, Cole finally spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I lost faith in everything. After them." He nodded toward the darkness where memories of his lost family seemed to hover like specters. Abigail tightened her grip on his hand. Maybe faith isn't something you lose forever," she whispered. "Maybe it just waits, until someone reminds you it's still there." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing beyond the battered woman who had stumbled half-frozen into his life. As if recognizing a survivor like himself, someone scarred but unbroken. Snow continued to fall softly around them, muffling the world in a blanket of white. But within their small circle of firelight, a new warmth bloomed. Not just survival, but trust. Not just gratitude, but the first fragile stirrings of love. And for the first time in many years, Cole Hale allowed himself to believe that maybe he was not meant to walk through life alone after all. The sun rose the next morning behind a thick curtain of clouds, painting the world in a grim, colorless light. Cole saddled the horses in silence, his movements efficient but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Abigail watched him from a few steps away, clutching her threadbare coat tightly around herself. She knew without needing to ask it was time to go back to Ashridge, back to the town that had turned its back on her. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she mounted the horse Cole offered her. His hand lingered briefly on her boot, steadying her as if silently promising he would not let her fall. Not now, not ever. The ride down from the mountains was slow and cautious. Abigail's mind raced ahead of them, replaying the whispers, the hateful glares, the way even women she had once called friends had crossed the street to avoid her. She wasn't ready, she wasn't strong enough. And yet as she glanced at Cole riding just ahead, his broad back a silent shield against the world, she found something steadier than fear blossoming in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. By midday the outskirts of Ashridge came into view, bleak and unforgiving under the iron-gray sky. The town seemed unchanged, same sagging storefronts, same hollowed eyes peering suspiciously from behind dusty windows. Yet to Abigail, everything felt different. She was different. Cole dismounted first, helping her down with a firm hand. For a moment they stood there, two figures alone against the tide of judgment rolling toward them. The sheriff was waiting, near the general store, flanked by several townsmen armed with rifles slung carelessly across their shoulders. His face twisted into a frown as he saw them approach, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. "You're making a mistake, Bennett," the sheriff called out loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Harboring a woman like her, she's got blood on her hands." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Abigail's knees trembled, but she lifted her chin, willing herself to stand tall. She defended herself, Cole said, his voice calm but carrying over the square like a hammer striking an anvil. The sheriff scoffed. That's not what her husband's family says. My husband, Abigail said suddenly, stepping forward, her voice steady but raw, beat me for years. I bore it in silence because women like me don't get believed. We get buried right alongside our bruises. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. Abigail saw familiar faces, women from the church, old men who tipped their hats in the streets, now frozen, caught between disbelief and shame. She took another step forward. I didn't kill him in anger. I defended my life, and if you think that's something to be ashamed of, then shame on every one of you. Her words hung in the cold air, heavier than the snow-laden clouds overhead. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such a public confrontation. There's still the matter of law, he muttered. And what law defends a man's right to beat his wife? Cole's voice, low and fierce, cut through the murmur like a knife. His hand rested easily near his belt, where his revolver hung, but there was no threat in his stance, only a promise he would fight if he had to. Several townsfolk lowered their eyes, shuffling awkwardly in the slush. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The sheriff hesitated, then finally spat into the snow and waved a dismissive hand. Ain't worth the trouble, he muttered. Let him. Abigail stood frozen for a moment, scarcely able to believe it. Then she felt Cole's hand brush lightly against hers, grounding her in the reality of what had just happened. They had faced the town and won. The crowd dispersed slowly, some stealing guilty glances over their shoulders. No apologies were offered, but Abigail didn't need them. Survival, dignity, love. They were not things the town could give her. They were things she had reclaimed for herself. Standing beside Cole, under the heavy winter sky, she realized that redemption had never been about clearing her name in their eyes. It had been about finding the strength to no longer need their approval. Hand in hand, without another word, she and Cole turned and walked toward the edge of town, leaving the weight of judgment behind them in the snow. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Abigail and Cole left the heart of Ashridge behind. The town's heavy gaze no longer pressed against their backs. Instead, it faded like a bad dream swallowed by the winter mist. They walked side by side without speaking, yet the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It was something shared, something earned. Ahead, Cole's cabin waited, a place once haunted by grief, now holding the fragile seeds of a new beginning. When they arrived, the cabin looked smaller than Abigail remembered, hunched low beneath the thick snowdrifts, its chimney breathing a faint plume of smoke into the gray sky. Yet it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like shelter. It felt like home. Inside, the fire had burned low, but it was still alive, a stubborn glow of embers refusing to die. Cole knelt to feed it, his movements slow but sure. Abigail watched him from the doorway, a wave of gratitude rising within her so swiftly it caught her breath. Without thinking, she crossed the room and knelt beside him, taking a small log from the pile and placing it into the hearth with her. On hands, Cole paused, his dark eyes finding hers in the firelight. In their shared reflection, she saw everything that had passed between them. The fear, the loss, the fierce fight for survival, and something else, something newer and infinitely more fragile: trust. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply sat together, watching the flames catch and leap higher, throwing light against the cabin walls. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice low and rough as gravel. You don't have to stay. Abigail turned toward him, Philly, stunned by the words. For the first time, she saw the vulnerability behind his stoic mask, the fear that he might be asking too much simply by hoping she would choose to remain. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his hand, anchoring him. I'm not staying because I have to, she said softly. I'm staying because I want to. Cole's hand closed around hers slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. His grip was warm and firm, a lifeline offered and accepted. A soft smile touched the corners of Abigail's mouth, trembling but real. She had been buried under fear, grief and guilt for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply want something good for herself, and to reach for it without shame. They spent the afternoon repairing the cabin together, patching leaks, mending worn blankets, restoring the small battered space piece by piece. It wasn't much. The walls still leaned slightly, the windows still rattled in the wind, but to Abigail it was beautiful, because it was theirs. That night, as the fire crackled warmly, Cole produced a small object from his coat pocket. The old wooden horse Abigail had once found hidden beneath the blankets. He turned it over in his hands, the firelight catching the soft sheen of the worn wood. He held it out to her. For you, he said simply. Abigail accepted it with trembling hands, understanding the profound meaning behind the gesture. He wasn't giving her a toy. He was giving her a piece of his past, a piece of himself, a bridge between everything he had lost and everything they might still build together. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't born from pain. They were born from gratitude, from hope, from a love so deep it didn't need to be shouted or adorned with grand gestures. It was enough to be seen, to be trusted, to be chosen. As the wind howled softly outside the sturdy little cabin, Abigail leaned her head against Cole's broad shoulder, closing her eyes. His arms slipped around her, drawing her close, sheltering her not just from the cold but from every sorrow that had once threatened to break her. In the hush of the night, without fanfare or witnesses, two broken souls found silent redemption in each other's arms. They had survived the judgment of the world. Now, together, they would begin to truly. The days grew longer, almost without notice. Snow still coated the mountains, but the light began to shift, softer now with hints of warmth returning to the edges of the cold. And in that quiet thaw, a new season began, not only outside but within the walls of the cabin that Abigail and Cole now called home. They worked side by side each day, not speaking often but never needing to. Cole showed her how to build a new fence along the ridge, how to track deer prints through the snowmelt, how to listen to the wind and know what it meant. Abigail in turn showed him how to laugh again, not loud but soft and sure. The kind of laughter that lingers in a room like a memory worth keeping. One morning, as she swept the wooden floorboards and watched the steam rise from the pot on the stove, Abigail paused to look around. The same walls that had once held nothing but silence and grief now held blankets she had sewn, a basket she had woven, and a life she had helped rebuild. The little wooden horse sat proudly on the mantel beside a wild flower she'd pressed in a book and saved. It was no longer his cabin, it was their home. Word from town came slowly through an old trapper who passed by every few weeks. The whispers had shifted. People spoke less of scandal and more of survival. Some said they had judged too quickly, others said nothing at all, which to Abigail was its own kind of peace. Cole didn't care for town and never would. But for Abigail, the wound it had left was beginning to heal. She had stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. She had stopped defining herself by what they thought she deserved. One evening, she stood outside as dusk settled over the pines, watching the sky fade from blue to lavender. Cole joined her quietly, his presence solid and calm beside her. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble. Abigail thought for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No," she said simply. "There's nothing there for me now." She looked up at him. "Everything I need is right here." He turned toward her, and for once there was no shadow in his expression, no haunted silence, just the stillness of a man who had found what he didn't know he'd been searching for. "I used to think this place was where I came to disappear," he said. "But maybe it's where I was meant to be found." Abigail reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "You didn't find me, Cole," she whispered. "We found each other." And in that moment, simple, unremarkable, and utterly profound, they stood beneath the twilight sky, two souls no longer running from the past, but walking into the future together. There would be other winters. There would be hard days, but they would face them the way they had faced everything else, in silence, in strength, in love. In the firelight behind them, the cabin glowed like a lantern against the darkness, and inside it they built a life not of grand gestures or spoken promises, but of quiet mornings, warm hands, and the unshakable belief that even the most broken hearts can find their way home. Some stories aren't told through loud declarations or sweeping romance. Sometimes they're built in silence, in shared pain, quiet protection, and the slow, steady return of trust. Abigail and Cole weren't perfect. They were broken, wounded, cast aside, but in a world that tried to silence them, they chose each other, not with words but with actions. Maybe the question isn't who will save us. Maybe it's when we choose to stop running and start healing. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever found strength in someone's quiet presence, or become that presence for someone else? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales like this one.